The envelope was small, white, and terrible in the way ordinary things can be. Lu Yao found it on the mat beside her door, a court-stamped copy of a petition, the Shao family seal at the header, and 4 blunt words typed across the top that made her fingers go numb. Petition for divorce. She read them twice to be sure the paper wasn't playing a trick. Beyond the letterhead, the pages were a ledger of other, quieter things. Billing statements from the hospital after her father's arraignment, a copy of the prenup she had signed with trembling hands 3 years earlier, a list of deadlines and clauses that left her technically untethered and emotionally shocked. There was no flowery breakup letter, no accusation, just procedure, a signature, a filing date, a court clerk's stamp. Shao Yuncheng had been economical with words since the marriage had become a transaction he regretted. The voicemail she found next to the envelope felt like confirmation, his voice faint through the small speaker, the same clipped restraint she had learned to recognize as final. "We need to do this, for both our sakes. For both our sakes." He said it as a verdict. Lu Yao set the petition down beside Lai Fu's bowl. The cat, the only living creature that had not decided how shameful her family was, stretched, blinked at her, and twined around her ankle with a small, solicitous purr. The ordinary softness of a furred body under her palm was the only rebellion she permitted herself that morning. Later, when Aunt Xiao's calls started, when the household staff took to whispering in corners, when the social feeds and the gossip columns smelled of scandal left over from her father's disgrace, she would have to be composed. For now, she sat on the kitchen floor and let the cat breathe on her fingers. It had been 3 years. She had married Shao Yuncheng out of a necessity shaped like an ultimatum. Lu Qingshan's name had been enough to ruin a whole neighborhood. Prosecutor turned defendant, judge disgraced, evidence of favors traded for leniency that made newspapers breathe out in disgust. The fallout did not care which child sat at which wedding table or who had been naive enough to believe the system could be trusted. It looked for shields and offered them to those ready to take them. Shao Yuncheng's family had offered a shield. They had offered protection in the language of contracts and expectations, a marriage to right a wrong, a dowry of reputation, an unspoken trade. The prenup had been written in small letters and larger threats. Lu Yao had signed. She had not wanted to see her father rot in a cell. She had not wanted her mother's name dragged through the mud. She had not imagined that the shield would one day feel like a cage. Her reflection in the living room window that afternoon was a woman she barely recognized. A neat bun, a silk blouse ironed to sharpness, eyes that had learned to look past insult and toward the next step. Dignity had become a practiced thing. She wore it like an armor she could take off in private. The divorce petition hinted at something worse than scandal: indifference. If it was indifference he sought, he would have it. In the months since her father's arrest, Lu Yao had learned how to be invisible and indispensable at the same time. She negotiated with creditors in the lobbies of buildings whose marble made her fists ache. She sat through company lunches where the words family liability were buttered heavily and then left with the crumbs. She made small, quiet bargains, volunteer event in exchange for a favorable article, a favor returned with interest, a dinner where she smiled and kept her opinions to herself. At the billiards bar that night, she would demonstrate both kinds of power, public composure and private competence. The room smelled of lemon oil and cheap cologne. Neon lit half the faces into electric blues. Men in suits treated the pool table like a stage, making show of their aim and their jokes. Lu Yao moved around the table like someone with another life inside her, calm, almost bewilderingly centered. She played because she needed the company of strangers who didn't know the shape of her shame. She played because Chen was there, and because seeing him was like being allowed to breathe in a steady rhythm. Chen Junhao, or Brother Chen as people called him in a teasing half-respect, ran his own company, small compared to the Shao conglomerate but steady, growing, and run with a kind of watchful kindness. He was not the kind to make headlines, but he had the kind of competence that changed the rhythm of a room. He watched her with a tenderness she had not asked for, and did not refuse. "You're quietly dangerous," he said, as she sank a long bank shot. The cue clicked like a calculator. Someone at the bar whistled. The crowd loved winners. Lu Yao smiled without vanity. "You only say that because I don't make a show of it." Chen's smile was slow. You could make a show if you wanted. I like it this way. He had been there the day her father's arrest became public, on the outskirts of the courthouse, his hand on the small of her back, as if that touch could redirect the world. He had paid for a single advertisement, nothing garish, an article about corporate governance framed as advice for companies that wanted to insulate themselves from legal risk. His name was only a line in the column, but the gesture had been a public tether. He had been there when the photographers prowled like hyenas, and later, when the Shao family started to treat her as an inconvenient stain, he had brought soup to the household kitchen under the pretense of business. Small acts that cost him nothing and meant everything. Across the table, Mu-cheng watched from a corner, a smartphone forgotten in his hand. He was younger than Lu Yao by a decade, a prodigy who had come into the orbit of their lives because of work. He solved algorithmic problems for the Shao Tech wing and kept to himself unless anger brought him out. People called him a genius the way people called thunder a sound. It was loud, sudden, and a little frightening. There were rumors that his family had been tangled with the Shaos for generations, that debts and jealousies and a past tragedy made him volatile. He smiled at Lu Yao in that guarded way of someone who had learned that the world was a place where loyalty could be a weapon. And then there was Fu Shuiji, bright and polished and all the wrong things people said of women who wore power like costume jewelry. She was married to a rising politician and had once been friendly with Lu Yao, friendly in a way that tasted like manipulation. Now she sat across the room with Aunt Shao at her elbow, the two of them critiquing Lu Yao's outfit as if it were a trend to be corrected. You don't belong here, Lu Yao, Aunt Shao said when she came over like a storm with pearls. You must understand your position. Her voice was the quiet cruelty of those who have never been asked to explain themselves. Lu Yao's smile did not waver. I belong wherever I choose to be. It was a small rebellion and a truth. The words landed in Aunt Shao's eyes like pebbles, annoying, but not earth-moving. Fu Shuiji's laugh was thin. You are brave to be careless. There was a moment of silence, of pressure. Then Chen stepped forward. We're celebrating, he said. And he meant it. Celebrating a contract win, a friend's birthday, the fact that Lu Yao's presence made the room better. The tone was diplomatic and final. Later, when Lu Yao crossed the street with Lai Fu wrapped in her cardigan as if the cat were a child needing protection, she realized with a private, bitter humor that she had gone from wearing dresses she chose for herself to wearing armor the world approved of. The armor could deflect comments. It could not stop the hollow that opened when she read the divorce petition 3 hours ago. She did not answer her husband's calls that evening. Not because she was indifferent, but because answering would sound like a negotiation, and there was nothing to negotiate that wouldn't betray the quiet promises she had made to herself. She had married for protection. That protection had been a bargain that now felt transactional in a way she could not stomach. If he wanted out, let him sign the papers and go. If he thought he had bought the right to be her judge, he was wrong. But what she did not know, what the Shao family, the gossip columns, and the court documents did not yet show, was the small private thing that would complicate every calculation. She had missed her period. It was an almost absurd detail, mundane, intimate, utterly life-altering. The test she took in her bathroom at 2 in the morning showed 2 lines that trembled the way a small bell trembles in wind. Lu Yao's breath snagged. She sat on the edge of her bathtub with Lai Fu's weight in her lap, and thought of the smell of hospital disinfectant and the way her father used to hum while matching the hem of her mother's dress. She thought of every hard choice she had made, and how suddenly another choice would matter more than anything else. She wrapped her arms around herself like someone preparing for winter. The pregnancy was a secret she could not yet share. It was not even clear who the father would be. There was a neat, unsent series of messages in Shao Yuncheng's phone, but there had been other nights of kindness from Chen, other hands offered in comfort on nights that had nothing to do with love. She had no inclination to turn the child into a chess piece. For now, she held the secret like a small, fragile thing, and promised herself a new kind of courage. She would not be traded. She would not be silenced. News of her supposed indiscretion would have been prey for people like Fu Shuiji and Aunt Shao. She had learned to place herself in positions that minimized gossip, but the world is imaginative and sharp. She knew they would use any whisper to punish her. So she wore the news like clothing hidden under her coat, warm and private and steady. That night, in the private dining room the Shao family reserved for salvage operations and uncomfortable conversations, the air felt like thick glass. Shao Yuncheng arrived late. He walked in with the cool authority of a man who had been raised to carry decisions like polished coins. On one hand, everything in order. On the other, everything expensive. He sat down across from her and his eyes flicked over the small things. The soup bowl, her hands, the way she kept her posture unyielding. "I filed," he said, not as an accusation, but as a report. The words had the same flatness as a board meeting. Lu Yao squeezed Lai Fu's carrier under the table until her knuckles hurt. "You filed," she repeated, "because answers sometimes make the world simpler." His face did not change. "It's the cleanest option for both families." He spoke like a man reading a prepared statement. "And for me?" she asked. He did not look at her. "For you, it's a chance to start over." She had been married into the Shao name to start over, to shelter a family, and now the same name would push her into an unadorned future in which she would either become another cautionary tale or a woman who had learned to survive by force of will. The pronouns in those sentences shifted responsibilities in ways she did not accept. She had not been a liability to be transferred. She had been someone who had chosen to act, who had worked nights arranging meetings with lawyers who were willing to file injunctions and argue points about assets and the small, real things that would matter for a child no one yet knew about. Aunt Shao cut in with the practiced cruelty of an aristocrat used to trimming flaws. "This is proper. A clean separation is better for everyone," she said, as if Lu Yao were a stain that needed efficient removal. Fu Shuiji smiled like a mirror reflecting the ease of privilege. Chen's hand found the back of her chair, a small pressure that meant he was there, but would not interfere. "If you need anything," he said quietly, "call me." Those words, simple and offhand, felt like a contract of a different kind. When she was alone later that night, she opened her phone and read his message again. "If you need anything, I'll be there." There was no pomp, no attempt to outshine the Shao family's generosity. He had shown up not to buy her silence, but to be present. It mattered. It mattered more than the sheen of charity the Shaos offered. The house settled into the hush that follows family decisions. The servants whispered in the kitchen. Someone always seemed to be awake in a house that housed secrets. Lu Yao lay awake on the sofa, Lai Fu curled against her stomach, and thought of the small line on the pregnancy test. It seemed suddenly impossible to balance custody of self with custody of destiny. She had signed a prenup. She knew how precise law could be. She also knew how merciless the world could be to women carrying children whose paternity was disputed by gossip and money. She had to protect herself. She had to protect what might be inside her. On the other side of town, Shao Yuncheng poured himself a drink in a glass that threw shadows like small storms across his shirt. He had wanted the marriage for a reason that now felt paper-thin even to him. He had not expected the scales to tip toward pity, or to feel the brittle echo of humiliation when someone like Chen could be kind without demanding loyalty. He found himself in the quiet after the filing, thinking of the small ways Lu Yao had kept her head when the world blamed her for crimes she had not committed. For the first time, he considered that the person he'd treated as a ledger item had her own spine. But it was not an awakening so much as a disturbance. He told himself with the firmness of habit that the marriage had been an operation, a necessary compromise. He had been efficient. He had done what needed to be done. As the night stretched, he felt only the compression of decisions and the small, cool loneliness of a man who had learned to think in terms of alliances. The following days were a series of small, sharp disruptions. A supplier suddenly required renegotiation on terms Lu Yao thought secured. A project she had been quietly shepherding through the Shao Group's philanthropic wing was delayed on the pretext of reputational risk. The headlines, which had been a separate kind of cruelty, now came with pictures. Someone in the comments had found a decades-old photograph of her father with a man who was later under suspicion. The internet ate it like a feast. Through it all, Chen made himself useful in non-intrusive ways. A lawyer referred by one of his partners offered pro bono hours. A safety consultant he knew put the house's security on a temporary upgrade. When Lu Yao hesitated to accept, he shrugged. You don't have to take everything I offer, but let me help keep the ground steady while you figure out which bridges you want to burn. Trust came back in small increments. Trust, for Lu Yao, was not a flipping of a switch, but a procession of tiny, reliable things. Chen's presence was a quiet map of one way forward. Respect without assumptions, aid without purchase. It was different from the Shao family's tangled kind of benevolence that always seemed to have strings the size of bridges. Yuncheng, meanwhile, did not change his posture. He watched the current of the house and the gossip like someone studying a chemical reaction, noting precipitants and catalysts. He offered help the way a scientist offers data, practical, non-committal. But once, when the cameras had swarmed the courthouse and a particularly cruel reporter had asked a question about Lu Yao's motives for marrying, Yuncheng had stepped between the flashbulbs and given an answer curt and direct enough to silence the reporter. She has never used her problems as a show, he said. She fixes them. That moment made quieter news than it should have. People preferred spectacle to truth, but the fact had clung like a bandage. There were those who saw that Lu Yao had agency. The simmering hostility toward her found focus in small acts of sabotage. An invoice marked for a charitable donation was redirected. A shipment of infant formula, bought for reasons that had nothing to do with giving, went missing and turned up in someone else's warehouse. The Shao family whispered of logistics and mismanagement, while Fu Shuiji's smirk spread like an accusation. It was in these minutes of ambiguity that the story metastasized. Suspicion hollowed out the floor beneath Lu Yao's feet. As the tension mounted, her secret kept its own quiet pressure. The child, if she was indeed carrying a child, would change negotiations. It would complicate a prenup and create a moral argument for custody and support. It would force the Shao family into public care or private abandonment. She had to be ready. A week after the divorce filing, a charity luncheon presented itself as both a trap and an opportunity. The Shao family had publicized it as a reconciliation event, an invitation to those who believed in second chances, in corporate responsibility, in the idea that money could be used to wash reputations clean. Fu Shuiji's name was on the guest list. Aunt Shao would preside with the civil, chiseled smile of one who taught lessons in class and humiliation in private. Chen came as a friend, Yuncheng as a consultant for the charity's new digital platform. The press lined the entryway like birds waiting for a handout. Lu Yao dressed like someone who had learned that self-respect could be a weapon if wielded with taste. She wore a simple dress, a brooch she had kept from her mother pinned to the lapel, and a composure that suggested she was not a woman in need of saving, but a person with decisions to make. The room hummed with polite applause when she walked in. People were impressed by a woman unbroken by scandal. It made for a better story than the one about ruins. At the center table, Aunt Shao watched with predatory politeness. Fu Shuiji sat beside her, a presence like a glass sculpture. Pretty from a distance, sharp if you touched it. You must be brave to take the stage after what happened. Fu Shuiji's tone suggested that bravery might be a show of courage or a lack of awareness. She picked at her salad as if its ingredients offended her. Lu Yao smiled and addressed the crowd in the way of someone who had learned to be economical with vulnerability. We're all here because we want to build something lasting, she said. Not just structures or funds, but communities where mistakes don't have to ruin people forever. Applause. The cameras were kinder to such statements. After she spoke, there was a sit-down reception. Waiters hovered with small bowls tucked under silver lids. It was during the second course, delicate white soup served in a bowl that somehow made the guest feel both privileged and fragile, that the plot tightened. Fu Shuiji approached Lu Yao under the guise of civility. You must be careful with what you eat, she cooed, the tone of someone dispensing sage advice. Stress, you know, it affects the body. Lu Yao looked at the bowl and then at Fu Shuiji with a soft, measured gaze. Thank you, she said. I appreciate the concern. Fu Shuiji handed the spoon to a server who placed it in front of Lu Yao with a theatrical niceness. Chen's eyes flicked up as if sensing the atmosphere had shifted. He brushed past with a wine glass and offered a comment about the event's success. Mu Cheng gave her a look that read like an equation and left it unsolved. Lu Yao lifted the spoon to her mouth. The soup was warm, perfectly seasoned. The world was a polite hum around her. Then, mid-bite, something in the room tilted. Her vision narrowed for a heartbeat. The bowl slipped in her hand. She set it down reflexively. The heat on her tongue was suddenly sharp in a way that made her throat seize. "Are you all right?" Chen's voice was near, the worry in it loud against the clatter of the dining room. She tried to say yes and found the word lodged. Her limbs suddenly felt hollowed out. She could hear Aunt Shao's voice, shallow and sharp. Someone said, "Call someone." The room multiplied into small, panicked fragments. She had not been a woman prone to dramatic collapses. Her body, which had held up under long negotiations and selfish looks, felt as if it had been betrayed by something small and invisible. The world folded into the pale ceiling, into the overhead lights, into the gleam of cutlery. Lai Fu, safely in a carrier a table away, let out a complaint that sounded like alarm. Chen was at her side in 2 strides, one hand steadying her shoulder, the other searching for the signs of a simple faint. Mu Cheng was next to him, his face an unreadable mask. Nurses in the crowd moved faster than men in suits. Someone called for an ambulance. A woman nearby, one of the charity's medical volunteers, started to check her pulse. Lu Yao's hands fumbled for the chair arm. The taste of the soup had turned bitter. The world turned on a single, ominous axis. She thought of the pregnancy test in the small drawer of her bedside table, cold and accurate and private. She thought of the prenup and of paperwork that could not protect a child from a hidden act. She thought of choices, and of the men who would try to define those choices for her. Something hot and small coursed up her throat and out her eyes. Tears she could not explain, not the decorous kind but the raw, elemental ones that feel like smoke from a house you are trying to save. As paramedics entered the hall with measured efficiency, Chen held her hand and squeezed, a pressure that said nothing so much as, "I am here." She wanted to tell him all the things she could not say, about the petition on her doorstep, about the small line on the test, about the way the world tried to polish away a person and leave an empty object in her place. Instead, she let herself be carried like a small, fragile package across a sea of faces. Someone yelled that the soup had been uneaten by others, and that she had been singled out. Someone else remembered seeing a hand, a waiter arranging dessert, move with a tiny hesitation. Fingers pointed in complicated ways, suspicion began to trail like a scent. Fu Shueji stood, perfectly composed, watching as the room filled with the rustle of emergency protocol. Her face was unreadable. The ambulance door shut with the neat finality of a casket lid. Chen climbed in beside her without permission and did not ask for it. He put his coat over her knees, and the world outside the vehicle blurred into streaks of neon and sirens. He used the time between hospital dispatch and arrival to speak in short sentences into the medics' ears, to give them the small facts he knew, that she might be pregnant, that she had been exposed to the soup she had eaten, that she had known recent stress, and had been subject to public defamation. The medics were professionals. They typed into tablets and asked questions in the neutral tones of people trained not to be moved by drama. Mu Cheng rode in the back of the convoy in a car like a shadow. He texted someone a single line of code that read like an instruction. The text was a tiny promise. Check the CCTV from the service door. He would follow the line of data like a bloodhound and not allow conjecture to flourish in the dark. At the emergency entrance, staff took her in without ceremony. Hands were skillful, efficient, precise. Someone from the charity left later, with perfume tracing the air of the hospital hallway and a report being shaped that would sound clean and necessary when repeated. The first blood tests were drawn with gentle, clinical authority. The initial notes said only, suspected food poisoning, cause undecided. Toxicology would take time. Outside, the Shao family clustered like storm clouds, speaking quickly and with resource in every sentence. Aunt Shao's face had that calm hardness of someone who could transform emergency into strategic advantage. Fu Shueji's expression wavered for just a second when the medics confirmed Lu Yao might be pregnant. Then it stiffened into the illumination of a person who could adapt her performance to new lights. Chen stood under the harsh hospital lights, hands in his pockets, the weight of his watch like a small, private compass. He had always been good at making practical decisions. He now made one that mattered more than any contract. He called a lawyer he trusted, one who owed him a favor, and he told them to meet him at the hospital. In the emergency room, Lu Yao lay under the bright lamps and allowed the professionals to take readings. Her mind was a map of things to do. Call the lawyer, secure an independent medical test, ensure no one who wanted to manipulate her could control the evidence. She thought of Shao Yuncheng's petition, the way the world had assumed she was supposed to be grateful for his charity, and judged if she wasn't. Now the petition felt like a document written by a person who had believed he could make her small and keep her there. "Whatever happens next," Chen whispered close to her ear, "we'll make sure it's fair." His voice was calm in that merciless way. It did not buy her autonomy. It offered an ally who would stand beside her as she constructed her own boundary. There was something in that, an offer, not a trade. Outside, Mu Cheng's fingers negotiated cameras and records. He found the CCTV that showed the kitchen door and the way the waiter moved. The footage was grainy, like memory. In it, someone adjusted a bowl while nobody was looking. The motion was tiny. The hand that moved was gloved. He rewound, slowed it down. Then he sent the clip to Chen with a single line. "Watch." Chen watched and his jaw tightened. "Someone's trying to frame her," he said, and the words arrived like an accusation wrapped in grief. Inside the ER, tubes and monitors became a second skin for Lu Yao. They read her blood pressure and pulse and charted the toxins they could detect within the limits of the initial battery of tests. For now, the readings were alarming but survivable, professional phrasing for a thing that had nearly taken her. The fact that she was possibly pregnant complicated everything. There were new ethical lines to consider. When the doctor spoke, his voice was the clinical voice that misleads with its calm. "We'll run a full toxicology. It will take time. Right now, the matter is stabilization." They whisked her off to a private room. Chen pulled a chair to the bedside and closed his eyes for a moment, as if the act could stave off a worse nightmare. Outside the footprint of the hospital, news began to coalesce into narrative. Prominent woman collapses at charity luncheon. Possible food poisoning. Shao heir divorces wife, tragedy strikes. The headlines would glom onto causality because it sold. No one bothered with the clauses, the lives behind the verbs, the messy shades of motive. They wanted a clean story. Lu Yao lay with her hand over Laifu's small body for the first time since the ambulance had taken her away. The cat seemed to understand the urgency, purring as if it could knit some calm into the air. Her mind was a shrapnel field of possible futures. A child in the midst of scandal, a prenup that shut her out, a husband who had filed a petition as if it were a verdict. Chen spoke little, but his presence filled the space with something like steadiness. "We'll get the toxicology results," he said. "We'll get CCTV. We'll get everything. They will not make the story for us." His voice was a vow in small, practical units. Lu Yao thought, with a new, fierce clarity, that she would not let her life be shaped by the people who judged from the periphery. She would not be a passive object in someone else's narrative. She would choose. That choice for now had to be tactical. She had to prove that the soup was tampered with, that someone had intended harm. She had to keep the pregnancy, if it was confirmed, safe from being currency. She had to gather allies who saw her as a person and not a problem to be solved. As the machines hummed and the clock marked off small, unsentimental minutes, Lu Yao felt something settle into her chest that was not fear so much as a slow, gathering resolve. The divorce petition had been an igniting spark. The soup had been a dangerous shove. Now, with her dignity bruised but not broken, and with Chen's quiet loyalty at her side, she began to assemble the small, necessary things: phone calls, legal advisors, evidence requests. Outside, shadows lengthened. The world was still making its bargains and its headlines. Inside, the room hummed with more practical things: an IV drip, the steady beep of the monitor, the soft, patient breathing of a woman who had no intention of being taken apart by rumor. The first streaks of clarity came with the toxicology preliminary, a compound consistent with a nervous stimulant at low concentrations, enough to make someone weak, but not lethal. Not yet. The report came in a careful hand. Confirmatory tests would take longer, but it was a start. Someone had tried. Mucheng's message arrived then, just 2 words and a clip. The kitchen footage, slowed, showed the small gloved hand. It was not a decisive piece of evidence on its own, but it was a line. It was an accusation. More importantly, it suggested someone had worked quietly and with intention. Lu Yao tasted the irony of being at the center of a calculus she never wanted to be part of. She had been a shelter for her family, and had hoped that doing the right thing would be enough to keep them safe. It had not been enough. "Who benefits from making you disappear?" Chen asked gently, because sometimes the question itself cut deeper than a plan. She thought of Aunt Shao's expectations, Fu Shuiji's thin smile, the Shao family's desire to dissociate, to be clean. She thought of the people who had lost more than reputation, those who had been replaced by convenience. In the quiet dark of the hospital, she felt the outlines of a conspiracy as if they were pages in a book she was flipping too quickly. Each name could be a suspect. Each motive fit some small measure of logic. She also thought of another thing. The child, unnamed and impossible for now, who belonged to no ledger, and yet would be hurt by the ledger's pen. She held on to that thought like a rock against the ambition of others. When she finally fell into a thread of sleep between tests, the last thing she dreamed was the felted green of a pool table and a cue in her hand. A simple, honest instrument. In the dream, she sank the final ball with a move that was all skill, no show. It was what she wanted for her life. To win not because of spectacle but because of competence and calm. Outside, somewhere beyond the sterile circle of fluorescent light, the machinery of power was already moving. The Shao family would prepare statements. Fu Shuiji would craft a version of events that made her appear more tragic than culpable. Aunt Shao would call in favors and lawyers. Chen would call his people and make plans in a way that looked quietly like protection, not purchase. Lu Yao woke with the taste of bitterness behind her teeth and the sound of the monitor's beep like a metronome. The tests would, she knew, take time. There would be hearings to schedule and narratives to untangle. There would be enemies who would smile in public and stab in private. But for the first time since the petition had appeared on her mat like a tiny, clean weapon, she felt a primitive, undeniable thing. She could choose. She could fight for the life inside her body and the dignity of her own name. She could keep the line on the test hidden, keep her child from being a bargaining chip, find allies who were not looking to be repaid. Chen's hand closed around hers and did not let go. "When the results come back," he said softly, "we'll know what we're dealing with." She looked at him, at the steady line of his profile, at the practical competence of a man who had never wanted to buy a life but had instead learned to protect one. For the first time since the petition had been filed, the future did not look like a ledger. It looked like a choice. Outside the measuring hum of the hospital, the world continued in its appetite for drama. The headlines would write themselves. People would take sides. But inside, where the monitors counted seconds, and Chen waited like a patient sentinel, Lu Yao prepared for a different kind of confrontation. She would collect evidence. She would demand forensic certainty. She would not, she decided with a firmness that did not need confirmation, let anyone else decide the fate of her life. And when the first clearer results returned, when a laboratory noted the presence of an uncommon stimulant and a technician confirmed the possibility of tampering, the room where she lay breathed in a new, dangerous expectation. It was the kind of thing that makes villains move more carefully and allies strap on their courage. Somewhere between the beep of the monitor and the rustle of documentation, Lu Yao made a quiet resolution that would shape her next moves. She would not be reduced to the role the Shao family had assigned to her. She would not allow a child she had not yet met to be used as currency. She would choose. Her choice would be made in public and in private. It would need witnesses, contracts, tests, everything practical and unromantic that law and human persistence could offer. She would learn to wage fights in the language of evidence, rather than the language of pleas. For now, the first stage was control. Control of information, control of access, and the slow, meticulous gathering of proof that would transform rumor into case files. It was a task for which she had no training, and yet which felt like the only honest work left. Later that night in the quiet between tests, Chen bent and kissed her forehead the way people touch things they intend to protect. His lips were cool and real. He did not promise salvation. He promised presence. He promised to walk beside her as she constructed the scaffolding of her defense. She let herself accept that promise, not because she needed rescuing, but because two steady hands were. She let herself accept that promise, not because she needed rescuing, but because two steady hands were often better than one when the world tried to rearrange you by rumor. Stay until the end, to see who she walks away with. The next days were a calculus of small certainties. Chen moved like someone who understood logistics the way other people understood breath. One careful decision after another. He rented, at his own expense, a team of private investigators to stitch together what the hospital and police could take time to assemble. He brought in a forensics consultant who knew kitchens and the ways people disguised their work. Mu Cheng mapped out the service entrances and the shift changes at the charity hall, overlaying the routine like a blueprint. They all worked in silence that made Lu Yao feel less alone. The initial toxicology provided a headline and a half-truth. It named a class of stimulants, not a killer, something that could make the heart stumble and the body feel like it had been hollowed for a moment. It did not name a conspirator. It did, however, change the tenor of the divorce petition from cold paperwork into the kind of thing that required active defense. The police came with the measure of official interest. Forms. Questions asked with the neutral ferocity of professionals trained to avoid the theater of a scandal. They listened to Chen describe the CCTV evidence. They requested footage. They took statements from staff at the charity event. They made the obvious call, treat it as an attempted poisoning, and investigate accordingly. On day 3, Mu Cheng brought them a small, grainy clip that tilted the world again. It showed the service corridor, the angle from the kitchen staff entrance. The footage was ordinary until a gloved hand entered frame, adjusted the lid of a batch pot, and retreated. The motion was quick, economical, practiced. Whoever it was did not fumble. Gloves? The detective asked when Mu Cheng replayed the clip for them. Professional, Mu Cheng said. Not a kitchen accident. The detective's mouth thinned the way the weather does before rain. We'll run finger and fabric tests, interviews. Meanwhile, in the Shao household, the press clustered with a kind of hunger that mistook speed for truth. Aunt Shao's public statements were composed to the point of cruelty, a request for privacy, an insistence on propriety, a veiled condemnation of instability. Shao Yuncheng's team put out a brief line about process and left it at that. But in private, the family moved like chess players who had misjudged an opponent. Fu Shuiji's calls grew fewer and more guarded. She posted images of philanthropic dinners and carefully filtered smiles. It was easy to maintain supply chains of optics. It was harder to cover fingerprints. The first tangible crack came when a payroll ledger, leaked or misfiled, showed a string of consulting fees paid to a shell company with connections to someone close to Fu Shuiji. Mu Cheng, who had been tracing money like a landscape of footprints, handed the ledger to Chen with a look that needed no translation. It runs through one of her contractors, he said. Not directly in her name, but close. Chen forwarded the ledger to the detective. The detective asked for bank statements and subpoenas, and the bank complied more readily than the insidious networks of influence anticipated. Small wires left a political PR account. Small wires turned into waitress tips at a later date, the sort of breadcrumbs that did not make sense until someone traced them back to an origin point. At the same time, the story around Lu Yao's pregnancy gathered its own orbit of gossip. Tabloids printed wild conjectures about paternity. Commentators turned medical privacy into public spectacle. Shao Yuncheng, watchful and conservative, saw an opportunity. If he could position himself as the reasonable caretaker now, sign a settlement that he could spin as generous, he might still control the narrative and keep reputations tidy. In private, he asked for a meeting. When he arrived at the hospital that afternoon, his tie was an admitted gray, like someone who had decided to disappear in style. He stood by the doorway and watched Lu Yao asleep in the afternoon light. Lifu stretched on the chair like a small island. There was no show of performance in his eyes. There was the quiet arithmetic of a man who knew how to convert gesture into headline. Money can fix many things, he said when Lu Yao woke, his voice measured. A larger settlement, medical expenses, private care. We can arrange a living arrangement while everything is sorted. It can be done quietly. Lu Yao stared at him for a long moment. There was a softness to her that did not mean weakness. "You already tried quiet," she said. "You quieted me into a house I had to share with your name. I will not be quieted again." Shao Yuncheng's jaw moved. He was not used to being refused. "Think of the child," he said. "Think of appearances." She shook her head. "Think of me." He left with a courteous bow that did not reach his eyes. Outside, he found himself answering to a private shame. He had never meant cruelty. He had meant efficiency. Yet in the efficiency, he had forgotten the texture of human promises. For a brief, unlit moment, he thought of the woman who had matched his decision-making with dignity, and he noticed, for the first time, what he had been callous toward. The notice passed like weather. He would rationalize it into strategy by nightfall. He was well trained in elbowing his conscience into rational corners. The police made their first arrest a week later. Not Fu Shuiji, not Aunt Shao. It was a server from the charity's catering company, a young man whose debts had made him pliable. Under interrogation, he cracked, the kind of quick thing desperation produces. He named an intermediary, someone who had offered cash for discreet handling and had provided the gloves. The intermediary's contact trace rerouted to a company that had been used as a buffer for political favors. The bank records showed the chain, small payments that, when stacked, were not small at all. The chain landed, finally, on a face shown in high-resolution confirmed footage, a woman in expensive heels, decisive in the surveillance clip, speaking to the head of catering with a voice that suggested command. Fu Shuiji denied everything through counsel and charitable statements. But the evidence, bank transfers, the gloved hand on camera, a witness who had seen her linger near the serving station, was a mouthful the court could not ignore. Under pressure, her alliances thinned like old paint. People distanced themselves. Aunt Shao executed the kind of social sledging she had perfected. A distant outrage, a strong line about unfortunate coincidences. But inside the Shao house, cracks widened. The press had their feast. The police had their file. The legal system began its slow public choreography. Fu Shuiji's lawyer offered denials. A private investigator found a receipt that suggested Shuiji had been at the charity earlier that day in a legitimate capacity. But legitimacy does not preclude malice. The detective found, in an employee's phone, a text message whose tone suggested orchestration. "Make it quick." The phone's owner fingered the message and whispered, "She needed to look like an accident." The boardroom at Shao Enterprises felt like a theater of echoes. Projects stalled. Investors sniffed air and stepped cautiously. The philanthropic wing's flagship project, one Lu Yao had been quietly shepherding, hung in the balance. Chen saw the danger and moved. He made a call to a partner of his, proposing an acquisition of the philanthropic project into his own company's portfolio. It was strategic. He knew better than to take on an entire conglomerate's projects cheaply, but it offered a public lane to protect the program and to keep Lu Yao connected to meaningful work. Chen's offer was not flamboyant. He carved it with precision so neither a purchase nor a takeover would make it look like charity. He simply lifted the project with a proposal that respected the community stakeholders and promised continuity. The press noted the move as a sign of someone stepping up. Lu Yao watched the transfer with a mixture of relief and a new wariness. She did not want to be indebted to anyone. Mu Cheng, meanwhile, drew closer in ways that were obvious to everyone around them and infuriatingly subtle to Lu Yao. He had his own demons, an uncle who had been swallowed by the Shao family's shadow years ago, legal debts that had been quietly settled in exchange for a silence that cut deep. His care for Lu Yao read like a ledger of unspent favors and protective logic. He began to attend court sessions not as an observer, but as someone who wanted to keep the lines of possibility open. His presence triggered whispers. Was he a lover? A hacker? A dangerous element? They all were true to fragments of his story, but none captured the whole. Then, the bomb threat. It arrived 2 weeks after the poisoning, during a public hearing about the charity's funding. A hearing with a panel and cameras and an audience that included donors and a small swarm of activists. A call to the city police warned of an explosive device in the building. Evacuation procedures were quick and methodical. Someone tried to make the moment bigger than it was. Others wanted the cameras to capture the chaos. The room emptied into the courtyard like a slow exhale. Lu Yao was not scheduled to speak that day, but she had come to observe, to offer testimony about the program's community impact. She found herself evacuated with everyone else, standing in the cold light as police officers cordoned the building. People clustered in small groups. Aunt Shao hovered in the distance like a gloved storm. Chen's hands were steady when he found her in the crowd. "Stay with me," he said. "We're not going anywhere." Yuncheng moved through the perimeter and came back with a look that belonged to someone who had followed leads and now saw a pattern. He handed Chen a small list: names, suspicious wires, a supplier who had been in 2 unrelated events earlier that week. They compared notes with police quietly, not wanting to contaminate the investigation with too many volunteers. As the bomb squad swept the building, a bystander grew hysterical. The cameras, inescapable, hungry for drama, trained on the police line. Someone shouted that they had seen a figure leaving the delivery dock, a flash of movement caught by a security camera. The image, slowed and brightened, showed a figure in a delivery jacket. The jacket's insignia matched a logistics company that, if Yuncheng's eyes were to be believed, had been hired by the same intermediary who paid off the young server. In the end, the device was a crude container, chemicals and wiring that demonstrated intent rather than engineering. It was dangerous, yes, but not a sophisticated weapon. The ransom of it was the threat itself. Someone wanted to make the world feel unstable. The device was carted away. The footage, once analyzed, showed the delivery person taking a left at the cafeteria corridor, right past the charity's kitchen entrance. The police arrested the courier on the spot. In interrogation, he babbled names. When confronted with the banking evidence tied to the intermediary, he folded. He talked about cash, pressure, and the same middleman who had arranged the catering workers' compliance earlier. The middleman's trail, like a thread pulled from a sweater, eventually revealed a familiar face at the outer edge of the Shao orbit, a PR consultant who worked for Fu Shuiji's circle. Faced with the cascade of arrests and the bank transfers that no longer lied, the circle around Fu Shuiji tightened decisively. Her phone calls went unanswered. Her social life, practiced and glossy, bleached into statements from lawyers and a decision to step back from public work until the investigation concluded. The Shao family, relieved but not cleansed, issued anodyne comments about the importance of due process and private grief. Yuncheng, who had once been a wild variable in Lu Yao's life, found himself in a rare public moment. A reporter cornered him outside the courthouse and asked whether he felt responsible, given his historical family entanglement with the Shaos. He answered as he always answered, with a measure of blunt truth. "I am not without a past," he said, "but I am very present now." There was a moment after the arrests when Lu Yao felt the world lean toward equilibrium. The legal cases against the intermediary and the courier were quick by the standards of such things. They did not fix reputations. They made an account ledger. Yet they provided Lu Yao with what she had asked for: proof that the soup had been tampered with, that the charity luncheon had been used as a stage for violence, and that a chain of payment led back to those who profited from public spectacle. In the wake of the arrests, the Shao family held another of their sanitized gatherings. This time, the atmosphere felt less triumphant and more exhausted. Shao Yuncheng attended with a face that had finally shed the gloss of certainty. He had read the reports. He had sat across from ledger lines that implicated people he had treated like ornaments. There was a late, complicated apology that never quite reached Lu Yao's ear because she had arrived with Chen at his company's small office to discuss the transfer of the project. Chen's office was modest, the kind of space scaled for people who build things with persistent labor rather than headline wealth. He proposed a role to Lu Yao that cut to the marrow of what she wanted. Not a cosmetic advisory position, but a director role that would allow her to steward the charity's vision. "You run it," he said. "We fund it. You don't answer to us day to day." His tone contained no triumphant offer. It was a simple, professional structure, resources matched with competence. Lu Yao considered it and felt something inside her unfasten. This was not a rescue. It was an invitation to do the work she found meaningful, with legal protection and stability. The legal team drew up a contract that included a clause she insisted on: full control of program decisions, a transparent accounting clause, and a provision that no one could leverage the project to exert influence over her personal life. Chen signed it without theatrical flourish. He also wrote in a clause for medical care and a trust for the child, to be managed with independent trustees. Lu Yao approved. No strings, he said. Just structure. When word of Chen's move leaked, carefully managed press releases that emphasized community continuity, a different story circulated. People began to paint a picture of a man who was in the business of stewardship, not drama. The small measures of respect built up into a public narrative that suited Lu Yao. She was not a passive charity case. She was a professional steward with a seat at the table. Shao Yuncheng watched all of this with a reconnaissance that had the edge of jealousy. He had offered money and framed it as care, but here was Chen providing structural independence. In the quiet of his office, he considered the arithmetic of influence and the ways gestures hardened into leverage. He thought of himself as practical. He had not expected to feel the sharp sting of being outmaneuvered in the court of human decency. It was not just the legal victories that shifted the terrain. Mu Cheng's arc too changed under scrutiny. He had been suspected by some because of his volatile loyalty and because his resentment of the Shaos had been known to burn hot. But during the interrogations he had conducted, quietly behind the scenes, he found a thread of evidence that pointed not to him, but to the person behind the intermediary. He had followed the money to a PR consultant who had taken direction from a woman with political ambitions. When the consultant flipped, evidence in hand, he sat in a small room and let the weight of his relief sink in. That night, after the testimony, he came to Lu Yao's apartment with a wrapped pack of instant noodles and a look that asked nothing. "You okay?" he asked. She smiled, weak and real. He had a way of being present without performance, bringing exactly what was needed and nothing more. "I am," she said. "Tired, but okay." He pulled a chair and without comment began to dismantle the last of a tangled knot. He told her between bites of cold noodles and the noises of the apartment, the story of his uncle, and the way the Shao world had swallowed small people to make itself smooth. He did not ask for sympathy. He wanted instead to explain the matrix of causes that had made him defensive. He offered reparations in the form of patience. "You saved me with code and records," Lu Yao said at last. "You saved yourself," he answered. "I only kept the map." Mu Cheng's violence when it came was not sensational. It was small and desperate and human. He confronted the consultant in an alley, something he should not have done. He lost his temper. He struck the man and yelled. The footage made the social feeds for one morning and disappeared. The narrative, predictably, tried to peg him as a danger. He was questioned and reprimanded. He apologized publicly, and his contrition was sincere because the violence had come from a place of fear and protective anger. The court accepted his cooperation as a mitigating element. He pled guilty to a misdemeanor and was fined. The larger crimes were prosecuted without him. The public read the incident as a wrinkle in a romantic subplot. In reality, it was a human failure and a small truth. Love and loyalty can make people clumsy. Through the legal turmoil, Lu Yao grew more resolute. She had a child to protect now, a life under construction, and a name she wanted to own rather than rent. Shao Yuncheng's counsel returned with an offer: withdraw the petition, a financial settlement, a private medical trust for the child, and a promise that the Shao name would not be used against her in public. The offer was generous in the blanks that fit legal measures. But money had been the tool that walled her in before. She had signed away things for the sake of her father's peace. This time, she refused to sign from a place of fear. She asked instead for terms she could accept: a transparent trust for the child that could be audited, no gag order that robbed her of voice, and a clause that maintained her rights to custody and to live her life away from the shadow of control. She wanted dignity, not silence bought by cash. Shao Yuncheng was taken aback. He had assumed his offer would be a relief. He hadn't accounted for the fact that Lu Yao, in the crucible of near violence and the threat to a child, had discovered an appetite not for survival alone but for independence. "We can work out something fair," he said, softer now. She set her terms and watched him measure them. In the end, he signed more than he expected. The signature was neither loving nor grand. It was pragmatic. For him, it bought a limit on scandal and a clean ledger. For her, it bought control. It was at the signing of those papers that Chen appeared not as a suit in the background, but as a man with a pen in his hand. He had drafted a parallel agreement, a legal covenant between him and Lu Yao that was not marriage but partnership of a different sort. He wanted to ensure that if they chose to become a family, they did so on terms she wrote. He proposed a caretaker trust for the child and an employment contract that would ensure she had autonomy at work. He offered medical security and a home that would be in both their names, not a gift, but a shared asset to be managed together. He asked nothing in the clauses about expectation or ownership. He left space for choice. She read it in a quiet room full of legal tapes. There were no grand gestures. He slid the documents across the table, his expression plain. "Sign if you want to," he said. "If not, I'll still make sure you have what you need." Lu Yao felt something unfasten. This was not the Shao offer. It required no erosion of self. It offered continuity without control. It did not deny the past, but it refused to let the past define future structures. She signed. Some people called it a prudential arrangement. Others called it an engagement in the language the tabloids used. For Lu Yao, it was a set of careful choices. She liked that description best. The months that followed were an accretion of small, honest things. The court sentenced the middleman and the courier. Fu Shuizhi faced charges of conspiracy and was barred from holding public charitable posts pending trial. The Shao family's public reputation had been buffed but not restored. Reputations have a curing timetable that does not align with human forgiveness. Yuncheng, having paid his fine, retreated for a time to the lab work that had always steadied him. He stopped dramatizing his loyalty. He expressed it in long nights of coding and in small gifts, a repaired laptop, a red thermos with a note that said, "For long nights." He remained a friend, a presence that was complicated and true. Shao Yuncheng attempted at first to be present in a new way. He asked about the child's future. He sent messages with well-chosen words. Lu Yao received them and filed them in her memory the way one might file a weather report. A note of forecast, not commitment. He came to one of the charity's events as a donor in the crowd, not imposing. For a moment he watched her on stage and felt both admiration and the sting of a man who wanted to rewrite the past. But Lu Yao's decision, once made, communicated a kind of finality that his wealth could not purchase. Their relationship closed as it began, in business-like terms. They signed the final settlement in a small, formal room. There was no dramatic farewell, no implosion. The end was a stack of papers and signatures that made legal sense. He left with a polite bow. She closed the folder and felt the relief of a door finally latched. The last public hurdle was the trial. It was messy in parts and clinical in others. Testimony, CCTV analysis, witness statements, the parts that made narratives sensible in a court's eyes, stacked up. Fu Shuizhi was convicted of orchestrating the poisoning and the attempted bombing. The verdict was not a cure for reputational harm, but it was a piece of justice measured in pages and dates. In court, she appeared composed, haughty in a way that had the veneer of denial. The judge, sober and patient, read the verdict and the sentence. Justice did not feel theatrical. It felt slow and necessary. After the verdict, a small breath of normalcy drifted into Lu Yao's life. She continued her work with the charity, now firmly under the aegis of Chen's company, which allowed her to build the program with the autonomy she had demanded. The community projects flourished under her direction. The baby was born in a hospital room lined with quiet light, with Chen present at the edges, and Mu Cheng hovering with a camera, as if to stake the memory in pixels rather than newspapers. Shao Yuncheng did not attend the birth. He sent flowers and a check to the trust. The child, a girl Lu Yao named Jing, arrived with a grimacing little cry and a full head of dark hair that looked like a promise. The birth was not cinematic, no miracles, just competent doctors, and a woman who had endured more than the newspapers could print. The first time Lu Yao held Jing, she felt a clarity the previous months had taught her. That agency meant protecting the child from being used as leverage. That motherhood did not erase her rights to name her life. Chen was, in the months after the birth, both steady and careful. He slept in a fold-out in the hospital room the first night and held Lu Yao's hand in a way that was not ownership, but partnership. He learned the curve of Jing's sleep, the tiny ways a newborn startled at certain noises, and he began to arrange his life to accommodate them. He did not flood her with vows. He offered logistics, loyalty, and a slow consistency. On the day Lu Yao left the Shao family home for the last time, it was raining in an indecisive way, cold, courteous drops that washed the city of the gloss of summer. She packed what she needed into a simple suitcase. Lai Fu, old and unimpressed by grand drama, sat on the bed and blinked like a small sovereign ruler. Chen waited on the stoop with the car warmed, and the heater cracking small lines of comfort in the interior. Shao Yuncheng watched from the window as his former wife, composed, quiet, distinct, descended the steps. The sight of her moving apart from the world he represented struck him like a fact he hadn't negotiated. For the first time he considered the cost of resolution. He thought of the paper petition that had set this in motion, and he felt the peculiar sting of a man who recognized that some things are better left not possessed. They stood in the shallow rain for a second that stretched with significance. Chen took Lu Yao's hand, the one that had learned to sign contracts and to make crosswalk decisions. He looked at her as if consulting an inner map he had respected for months. "Are you sure?" he asked, in the non-theatrical tone that had become their shared language. "I am certain," she replied. There was not a tremor in the voice that had been tuned by hardship. There was a new timbre, alloyed with resolve. He nodded. The car pulled away from the Shao gate and into a gray corridor of city, and for the first time in years, maybe in her life, Lu Yao felt the freedom of things made by choice, rather than by obligation. They moved into a small house that belonged half to Chen's company portfolio and half to their mutual plans. It was not palatial. It did not need to be. The kitchen had a sink that scrubbed dishes of long dinners and a window that let in the first light. Lai Fu found a windowsill and claimed it as imperial property. Mu Cheng came by more often, sometimes for lunch, sometimes to leave a cable at the back of a computer. He remained a loyal if complicated friend. He would always be part of the knot in her history. That was fine with her. Their first dinner as something that resembled a family was simple. Noodles and steamed vegetables, a sofa, and a small crib in the corner where Jing slept with the occasional kitten paw exploring her toes. Chen ladled soup, carefully tasted first, and made a small joke about soup bowls now carrying only warmth and nothing else. Lu Yao smiled in a way that was closed to old vulnerabilities. They did not announce an engagement in grand terms. They did not make a social media spectacle of their life. They had, between them, written an agreement, safe for the child, fair to both of them, a modern prenuptial framework that protected autonomy and ensured joint responsibility. They called it, privately and humorously, the dignity contract. It had clauses that made legal scholars blush and a line that read, mutual respect as non-declinable. Shao Yuncheng reached out after a while with a small note of reconciliation. Time, he suggested, might be a salve. She accepted in the manner the times demanded. With civility, they kept their interactions to what mattered, the child's trust fund, the legal settlements, and the mannered exchange of statements. He, for his part, learned to admire the woman he had once treated as an expedient. He learned the lesson of status unaccompanied by empathy. Fu Shueji was removed from charity boards and faced civil suits that barred her from public fundraising for years. The verdict was not meant to transform her character. It was meant to set consequences. She faded into a quieter arena of politics where, for a time, her name mattered only in policy briefs and the occasional sharp op-ed. Lu Yao's life settled into a rhythm that matched her temperament. Work in the mornings, policy meetings that she attended with the same dignity she had used at the billiards table, afternoons with Jing in the park, and evenings of quiet sometimes broken by a call from Chen's office with questions about a tendered bid. The public's appetite for scandal moved on. New stories demanded its devotion. Her privacy, once corroded, rebuilt itself slowly like plaster drying on a wall. Mu Cheng's career took a more public turn again. His algorithms gained recognition. He presented a paper at a conference and spoke with a steadiness that no longer needed to be defended by theatrics. The public gave him a brief burst of curiosity. The private world weaved him into quiet friendship. He loved publicly from the edge, and Lu Yao revered him as an anchor who had been willing to do the messy things loyalty sometimes required. The project Lu Yao led grew and prospered under a governance model that honored the community's agency over philanthropy's compact arrogance. The press sometimes wrote about it as a redemption narrative, sometimes as case study material. Lu Yao ignored the sensational language. She measured success in cups of milk bought for a neighborhood center, in a child's enrollment, in the slight ways people stopped seeing charity as a tax write-off, and more as a mutual covenant. Years later, in the quiet after a day of meetings, Lu Yao sat at the pool table that had become a touchstone, and sank a long shot she had practiced on the evenings when the city let her practice in peace. Chen watched with the slow, contented smile of someone who keeps an eye on the person they love when she is in her element. Laifu jumped up on the rail and batted at the cue like a small sovereign. Jing, older now by a few years and curious, clapped when the ball fell into the pocket. "You always were quietly dangerous," Chen said, repeating the line he had used once and turned into prophecy by the steady accumulation of his actions. Lu Yao smiled. "I prefer the word competent." He reached for her hand across the table, fingers lacing with the practiced steadiness of a man who had learned to be present without possession. They had no fairy tale ending in the sense of sweeping reversal. They had, instead, a life built by small, negotiated things, contracts that honored dignity, a child who was more than a bargaining chip, a house where quiet meals were the currency of closeness. The scars of the soup and the petition did not disappear. They remained as a map of what had been survived. One night, as they sat by the window watching rain make the city silver, Lu Yao thought of the white envelope on her mat, the petition that had once felt like a verdict. She had opened it and been terrified, but she had also found, in the spaces between panic and plan, the means to choose. "Do you ever regret it?" Chen asked quietly. Not the marriage, but the way she had insisted on agency, on the dignity contract, on refusing to let money buy her silence. "No," she said after a breath. "I regret a few things that happened along the way, mistakes on many people's parts, but not choosing to live my life by my own terms. The child deserves that. I deserve that." They held hands and watched the rain. Outside, the city kept making its bargains. Inside, a family of 3 and a cat had something simple: the ability to speak, to leave when necessary, and to stay when it was healthy to do so. When months later her story was recapped in a documentary about philanthropy and scandal, the producers asked for a tagline. Lu Yao declined to be reduced again. She asked instead that the piece highlight the program's growth and the beneficiaries' voices. They complied. In the last scene of her private life, Lu Yao walked into a small office and signed a document that gave her the final legal authority to run the charity independently. Chen signed as a partner and a supporter. Mu Cheng stopped by with a new gadget for the community center. Laifu, unimpressed by ceremony, slept in the sun. She had been filed for divorce once by a man who thought removing a name would silence consequence. He had miscalculated the woman he had tried to discard. She had left with a man who was a CEO, not because his title bought her life, but because he matched it with respect, resources used without the need to own. The title of his job meant practical protection, legal counsel, financial structures, and a public posture that shielded a family from intrusive forces. But what made the life real, what made the walking away happy and not merely strategic, was mutual consent and mutual respect. The cat leaped down and brushed against Chen's ankle. Jing toddled over with a paper drawing of a pool table and 3 figures. Lu Yao picked her up and kissed the top of her head. Chen took out a small pen, and for the first time in the quiet history of their private agreements, signed a promise in ink that would be meaningless to tabloids, but substantial to them. A promise to continue choosing one another. They did not announce the vow to the world, they lived it. The petition on the mat was a memory, no longer an instrument of shame but a beginning of the story she had decided to write herself.